Hi guys, welcome back to Read Proud. We are continuing with our George by Alex Gino book reading. Today we're going to read chapters 5 and 6. So here we go. Chapter 5, Auditions. After lunch, the class plodded through a spelling pretest, followed by a science worksheet on simple machines, but all George could think about was trying out for Charlotte. Maybe Kelly was right, and Ms. Udell would be so proud of George for being herself that she would give her the part. The minute hand of the clock was a terribly slow lever, pushing the hour hand imperceptibly forward. Finally, Mrs. Field's wrinkled knuckles rapped on the heavy glass window of the classroom door. Ms. Udell welcomed her in. She'd be watching the class while Ms. Udell auditioned students in the hallway. Outside of the lunchroom, she smelled like Necco candy wafers. "I congratulate you for all your patience," Ms. Udell looked directly at Kelly and winked. "The time has finally come to see how you fare as actors and actresses. Everyone who auditions will get a part." Ms. Udell would be auditioning students from both room 205 and Mr. Jackson's 4th grade class in room 207. Half of the roles would go to students from each class. Ms. Udell pushed her clunky wooden chair toward the classroom door. "Today, you are each reading Charlotte's or Wilbur's lines, but I'm also casting for Fern, Templeton, and the other characters. But if you do not audition today, you will not be cast in the play. If you'd rather not be on stage, don't worry. Mr. Jackson will need quality hands on the crew." "I was really worried," Jeff muttered. "Mrs. Fields," Ms. Udell turned her attention to the small woman who had pulled over a spare chair and settled herself quite comfortably at Ms. Udell's desk. "Thank you again for staying late. I do appreciate it. Anything for theater. Please do let me know if there's anyone you find is not mature enough to participate in our production. I'm sure I can find other accommodations for them." "The kitchen staff can always use a young set of scrubbing hands," Ms. Fields declared. Ms. Udell returned her attention to her class and waved a stack of colored index cards. "If you're interested in trying out, I will give you a card with a number on it. The number will dictate the order of your audition. Girls first, then boys. I don't expect you to have the lines memorized, but I do expect you to deliver them clearly and with enthusiasm. You will read only your part. I will read the lines of the other characters. While you wait, you may silently review your part. If you do not wish to participate, you may begin your homework assignment." Ms. Udell asked the boys who wished to audition to raise their hands. George joined them, lifting her hand just to the height of her head. Ms. Udell counted 6 blue index cards, shuffled them, and passed them out, along with 6 fresh copies of the practice part. George was number 6, last, the longest to possibly wait until her audition, with Wilbur staring up at her in bold, thick letters. George slumped in her chair and turned the page over. Ms. Udell then distributed 9 pink cards to girls who raised outstretched fingers and mouthed numbers to each other. "Yes!" exclaimed Kelly, who waved 2 fingers in the air at George like a victory sign. Janelle stood, waving a card with the number 1 on it. She held the door open for Ms. Udell, who pushed her chair into the hallway, where they both disappeared. George listened closely, but she couldn't hear a sound from the hallway over the murmurs and rustling papers inside the classroom. George tried to bury her mind in her homework. Monday night's homework always took forever because the spelling words were also vocabulary words, and Ms. Udell insisted that each student write an official dictionary definition of each word before using it in a sentence. With Mrs. Field's permission, George headed back to the back of the room. As she bent down to get a dictionary, someone in the room sniffled. George's stomach lurched when there was another sniffle and a snort, followed by the words, "Oh, Charlotte, I miss you so," and snickers. George bit her lower lip and walked the long way back to her seat to stay as far from Jeff's and Rick's desks as possible. By the time George was back in her chair, Janelle popped her head in through the doorway. Kelly bounced up and rushed out the door. Soon, she came beaming back into the classroom and announced with great flourish, "Number 3, you're up." Kelly gave George a thumbs-up sign and hunched over in her seat. A few minutes later, on her way to pick up a dictionary from the back of the room, she dropped a note on George's desk. It was folded into a small square. When George opened it, the folds formed a grid across the page, and the note read, "Charlotte, you'll be radiant. Kelly." George couldn't help but grin. Radiant was one of the words Charlotte had woven into her web to save Wilbur, and it had been one of their vocabulary words last week. It meant beaming and sparkling. And George couldn't think of a finer compliment. She took a break from her homework to recite her lines silently. She remembered them all, and she knew just when to pause to give the words their best effect. Maddie looked pale when she left the room, and even paler when she came back. Emma clutched her lines tightly. Maybe if the girls were terrible enough, Ms. Udell would be so relieved that George was good that she wouldn't care that George wasn't a girl. At least not a regular girl. There was a long wait after the last girl came back into the room as Ms. Udell listened to the students from Mr. Jackson's class. Eventually, Ms. Udell came in to announce that it was time for the boys to take their turns. Robert was first and came back bragging. Beat that, number 2. But George wasn't worried about the boys. Her competition was already back in their seats, writing definitions for words like gesture and narrator. Finally, the 5th boy, Chris, went out into the hallway. He was a chubby white kid with a toothy grin. He returned with a smile wider than ever and danced victoriously back to his seat. Then it was George's turn. In the hallway, Ms. Udell sat in the blocky wooden chair, the one that matched her blocky wooden desk. The chair looked awkward without its mate. "You don't have your sheet, George," Ms. Udell said. "Don't need it." "Well, that's a good sign. Means you must have practiced." Ms. Udell gave a kind smile. "But do speak up." Before Ms. Udell could say anything else, George closed her eyes and began. The first words rushed out of her mouth, but then she slowed into the cadence she'd practiced. She felt herself as Charlotte and gave each word her full attention as it left her tongue. The words felt even more like hers than they had in Kelly's room. George reached the end of Charlotte's monologue and was ready for the dialogue with Wilbur that followed. But George, but George didn't hear her cue. She opened her eyes. Ms. Udell was frowning and and a thick crease had formed across her forehead. "George, what was that?" she asked. Started George. "I need a drink." Okay. Started George, but there were no words to finish the sentence. Was that supposed to be some kind of joke? Because it wasn't very funny. It wasn't a joke. I want to be Charlotte. George's voice sounded much smaller now that she was speaking her own words. "You know I can't very well cast you as Charlotte. I have too many girls who want the part. Besides, imagine how confused people would be. Now, if you're interested in being Wilbur, that's a possibility. Or maybe Templeton. He's a funny guy." "No, thanks. I wanted..." "Okay, then." Ms. Udell eyed George oddly. "For now, we need to get into the room to get ready to go. Would you hold the door for me?" Ms. Udell pushed her chair back into the classroom, shaking her head. She announced that it was time to pack up and sent George's row first to the coat closet. George muttered to herself as she uploaded her math book into her bag. Stupid, 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 stupid body, stupid brain, stupid boys and stupid girls, stupid everything. She kicked at the leg of her desk, knocking it into Emma's chair in front of her. Emma turned back to give George a dirty look. George stared intently at the speckled tile floor and wished she were home in her bed. When Ms. Udell called her row, George hoisted her bag onto her back and shuffled over to the boys' line, still staring at the ground. In the yard, Kelly bounded up to George, her ponytail flopping behind her. "So, how'd it go? What did she think? Was she impressed or what? I bet she'll let you be Charlotte." "I don't want to talk about it." George scraped her foot against the pavement. "What happened?" Kelly cried, grabbing George by the shoulders. "Did you mess up?" "Leave me alone." George jerked back and tried to head to her bus. "Did she not like it?" "No, Kelly, she didn't like it. She hated it." "She said that?" Kelly's eyes were wide. "She thought it was a joke." "Oh, well, at least you tried," Kelly shrugged. "That's what my dad says." "Ah!" George screamed in Kelly's face. "I don't want to hear what your dad says." Kelly's shoulders shrank. She opened and closed her mouth, then turned toward her bus line. George took the steep steps onto her own bus and shuffled along the narrow corridor, her feet sticking to the rubbery floor. She picked an empty seat midway back and hoped that no one would take the spot next to her. Hugging her backpack tightly, she buried her head in the dark space between the backpack and her chest and held back her tears. "So, how were tryouts?" Mom asked later that evening. She'd just gotten home from work a few minutes before and had started on dinner by dumping a brick of frozen peas into a glass bowl. "I didn't audition," George mumbled. She sat at the kitchen table, tapping her pencil on her pinky. Early evening light fell through the window onto her fractions homework. "Why not? You practiced with Kelly for hours on Sunday." "There was a lot to memorize." "Gigi, you know every word to every commercial that comes on TV." She pulled a bag of frozen fish fillets from the packed freezer and arranged 6 on a baking sheet. George shrugged. "That's different." "I was just so excited to see my little guy on stage." Mom tousled George's hair. George brushed her aside with a shrug and buried her head deep in her homework. Neither of them said another word until Scott slammed the front door announcing his arrival. Wash up, Mom told him. Dinner's almost ready. Wash up? What makes you think I'm dirty? Because I've met you. You're always dirty. Now go wash your hands. With soap. Over dinner, Mom asked Scott about his day at school. It was awesome, Scott exclaimed. Oh, really? Mom was skeptical. Scott rarely showed much enthusiasm about his education. What happened? So we were in PE, and we had to go to the outside track and run a mile, and I have PE 6th period, right? Scott waved his fork around as he spoke. So there was this kid, he's not even out of shape really, but I think he has lunch 5th period, and I know he had macaroni because he ralphed it up all over the track. Mr. Phillips had to blow the whistle and let us stop early because he was afraid that someone would slip and fall in it. Mom started rubbing her temples at the mention of macaroni, and by this point had her head fully in her hands. Scott, she warned through tight lips. Scott ignored her. I was right up behind him when it happened, so I got to see the vomit up close. Some of the macaroni pieces were still whole. I think it was mac and cheese because it was all yellow. Scott! Mom shouted. Could you please tell a different story? Perhaps one less intimately related to the inner workings of the digestive system? Sorry, Mom. I'll talk about boring things. I know. How about George? He's always good for being boring. Your brother is not boring, said Mom. George had been staring directly at her food. She hated thinking about gym class, even someone else's gym class. Gym class meant boys yelling at her to run faster or throw the ball harder. She would hate to run a mile on a track with a bunch of them. What about the play you're going to be in with your girlfriend? Asked Scott. She's not my girlfriend, George said into her plate. Your brother didn't try out, Mom explained. Why not? Scott cried. You spent all weekend practicing for a play about a dumb spider and then you didn't even audition? Charlotte isn't dumb! George threw her fork down. It ricocheted off the edge of her plate and twirled end over end in the air. All eyes were on the utensil, which spun as if in slow motion. It hit the ceiling and bounced on Scott's head before rattling to the floor. Ow! Scott yelled. Did you see what he did, Mom? He tried to kill me! Scott, he couldn't have done that if he tried. It was an accident, and I'm sure he's sorry. Aren't you, Gigi? George nodded in a daze. She could still feel the weight of the fork in her hands. Then tell your brother so, Mom said, before heading to the freezer for some ice. Sorry, Scott, George mumbled. Scott rubbed his head and grinned. Man, you've got some arm on you. If you ever got in a fight, I bet you could be pretty good. Mom returned with a plastic bag filled with several pieces of ice. Scott held the bag on his head with one hand and resumed eating with the other. Well, Mom said, at least the injury hasn't affected your appetite. The flaky fish patties and soft peas required little chewing, and soon George's plate was empty. She asked to be excused and dumped her dishes into the stainless steel sink. She ran upstairs and closed the door to her room just as tears began to fall. She flopped onto her bed and cried into her pillow. She cried about Charlotte. She cried about being mad at Kelly. She cried about Ms. Udell thinking she was joking, but mostly she just cried about herself. Then she pulled the denim bag from the bottom of her closet and brushed her fingers against the glossy magazines. She rubbed the cool pages against her cheeks, leaving behind tear stains that warped the covers. She told herself she didn't care whether she ruined them. She should throw the magazines away, she thought to herself. She should get rid of them completely. But she couldn't just put them in the kitchen trash. Mom would see them and want to know where they came from. Even if George put them directly into the recycling can outside, someone might notice them. Besides, she wasn't sure whether she could dump her magazine friends like that, and even if she could, she couldn't stop wanting to be like them. So she hugged the magazines tightly to her chest and then packed them carefully away for next time. And now we are going to move on to chapter 6, after I take a sip, which is called Taken. Okay. Mom flicked on the light in George's bedroom for the next morning. Time to get moving. My alarm never went off. You already missed the bus. I'm driving you and your brother to school. Mom left the door of George's room ajar and cursed her way downstairs to the kitchen. George lugged her body out of bed, shrugged on some clothing, and plodded downstairs. Where's your backpack? Mom asked, brushing her hair with one hand as she guided her shoes onto her feet with the other. Upstairs, George answered groggily. Well, go get it. What about breakfast? You'll eat in the car, and don't forget your shoes. George gathered her things into her backpack, wiggled her feet into her sneakers, and trod back downstairs. Mom was already by the front door, rummaging in her purse for her keys. Where is your brother? I don't know, said George, probably still in bed. Well, go upstairs and get him. Tell him he has 1 minute to get down here, or it's no phone for a week. Can I pull the covers off him? Sure. George bounded up the stairs once more, this time with proper motivation. Parent-condoned sibling cruelty was a rare gift and not to be wasted. Mom had left the light on in Scott's room, but Scott was fully asleep, snoring away. George found the two bottom corners of his thick green comforter and whisked the blanket off in one solid yank. "Hey," Scott grumbled. "Mom said I could," said George. "She also said no phone for a week if you're not downstairs in a minute." "She just doesn't trust that I've got the situation under control," said Scott, already standing. He was wearing his favorite pair of jeans and a wrinkled black t-shirt. "I try to maximize my rest so that I can be at my best for my education. And what does she do? Complain, complain, complain." He ran his fingers through his curly hair a few times and slipped his feet into tall, unlaced boots. Then he slung his backpack over one shoulder and jogged down the stairs. George followed. "You look like you slept in that," Mom declared. "I did," said Scott. "And you haven't brushed your teeth, have you?" "Nope." Scott's grin grew wider. "You're disgusting," said Mom, resignation in her voice. "I'm a teenage boy," said Scott. "What do you expect?" Mom handed each of her children a granola bar, then motioned them toward the garage. "I still don't see why I can't just take the next bus," said Scott as he buckled himself into the passenger seat. Scott took the city bus to high school, not a school bus like George did. "Because the next bus isn't for 45 minutes, and by that time you'll have missed first period." Mom backed the car out of the garage and down the driveway. "It's only English. I already speak English real goodly." "You're a laugh riot, Scotto." As Mom drove away, she rambled on about how she needed a new alarm clock and how really her children were old enough to get up on their own anyway. And hadn't she bought Scott an alarm clock last year for Christmas for this very reason? George stared out the backseat window, counting telephone poles. When she was little, her grandfather had told her that if she counted 100 telephone poles in a row, an electric fairy would grant her one wish. George didn't really believe in the electric fairy anymore, and sometimes she didn't even know what she was wishing for. But counting telephone poles had become a comforting habit. Room 205 buzzed as students filed in and hung their jackets and book bags in the coat closet. A group of girls gathered by the pencil sharpener around Maddie and Emma, who showed off the matching temporary pink streaks that Maddie's older sister had put into her hair the night before. Ms. Udell suddenly pointed at George and motioned with one finger for her to come up to the teacher's desk. The desk had probably been in the same room since the school was built. It might have been even older than Ms. Udell. The original shiny coating was worn away completely in some places and deeply scratched in the rest. If you dug your fingernail into the desk hard enough, you could leave a mark in the waxy varnish. "You surprised me yesterday, George," Ms. Udell said, her reading glasses perched on her head. "I can't cast you as Charlotte, of course. I have too many girls who want the part." "I know." George hoped that Ms. Udell would let her take her seat. "But," Ms. Udell continued, "you did a good job. You have passion and dedication. Are you sure you don't want another part? You could be Wilbur." "Wilbur the dirty pig?" George shook her head. "That would be worse than not being in the play at all." "Or one of the other boy parts? Templeton? Mr. Zuckerman? The gander?" "No thanks." "Perhaps a narrator then? The narrators have a really important role. They keep the audience informed." George shook her head. She didn't want to be in the play, watching someone else be Charlotte. "Well, okay," Ms. Udell eyed George warily. "I guess you can be in the crew." The classroom door opened and Kelly bounded in. "Did I get a part? Did I?" Ms. Udell's focus turned to the bubble of ebullience bouncing in front of her. "Kelly, you will find out about your part when everyone else does, at the end of the day." Kelly gave an exaggerated sigh and headed off to the coat closet to join the group of girls huddled around Maddie and Emma. Ms. Udell turned back to where George had been, but George had already disappeared to her seat. As promised, Ms. Udell didn't share the names of the students in the play until the final moments of the school day, at which point she distributed scripts to the actors and gave some advice on how to memorize their lines. Kelly could be Charlotte. When she found out, she jumped nearly out of her seat and whooped with glee. Then she turned to smile at George, but George had turned her head to face the closet, shielding her eyes from view with her hand. It was bad enough that she wouldn't be Charlotte. Now she would have to listen to Kelly talk about it, and possibly nothing else for the next 3 weeks. Ms. Udell continued to read the cast list. Chris would play Templeton. He let out a deep yeah and pumped his fist in the air. Maddie, Emma, and several other kids would play the barnyard animals, and most of the rest of the kids who had tried out would be narrators. Kids from Mr. Jackson's class would be playing the parts of Wilbur and Fern. George's name wasn't said at all. George knew she couldn't have possibly expected to hear Ms. Udell call her name. Still, her heart sank. She had genuinely started to believe that if people could see her on stage as Charlotte, maybe they would see that she was a girl off stage too. When her row was called, George grabbed her book bag and got away from the other kids at the closet as quickly as she could. She packed her math workbook and her science reader. Room 205 headed down to the yard for dismissal. George didn't pay attention when the class stopped to regroup. Several times she bumped into the backpack in front of her. The moment the class stepped onto the schoolyard, Kelly dashed out of the girls' line and over to George. "How come you're not in the play?" she asked. "Ms. Udell said everyone who tried out would get a part, and I thought for sure Ms. Udell would make you Wilbur. You were so good this weekend. Rehearsals are going to be totally boring without you." Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, George, how come you're not in the play?" George cringed, recognizing Rick's voice behind him. Jeff almost never talked directly to George unless he had something really mean to say, but George wasn't surprised to see them both there when she turned around. "Last week you were all crying about the poor little spider," Rick continued, "and we saw you go out and audition. How bad did you have to be for Chris to get the part?" "I'll bet he read the stupid spider's part by mistake," Jeff smirked. "He's such a freaking girl anyway." Jeff guffawed, and Rick laughed along beside him. "Don't listen to them," Kelly tugged at the elbow of her best friend's shirt, but George stood stuck in place. The hairs on her arms stood straight up, and the back of her neck tingled. "Or maybe he just read it all backwards," said Rick. "Noi! Kanoi!" Jeff made a horrific sound, attempting to oink backward. Rick joined him, and they snorted across the playground toward the gate where parents sat in cars in a line down the block. She didn't exhale until Rick and Jeff passed through the gate. They didn't know her secret, or else they wouldn't have dropped it so quickly. But their guests had been so close that George's cheeks flushed with shame. She relaxed her hands, which had formed into fists, but her teeth were still clenched. "They're jerks," said Kelly. "You're not a girl." "What if I am?" George was startled by her own words. Kelly drew back in surprise. "What? That's ridiculous. You're a boy. I mean," she pointed vaguely downward at George. "You have a you-know-what, right?" "Yeah, but..." George trailed off and looked at the ground. She kicked a small rock that skipped into a tuft of grass. She didn't feel like a boy. They stood together in a heavy silence. Kelly's brow furrowed in thought. After a few moments, she spoke. I thought about whether I was a boy once, back when I wanted to be a firefighter and I thought all firefighters were boys. Is it like that?" "I don't think so, Kelly." The lines in front of the buses had mostly disappeared, and the drivers were only waiting for their final okay to start their routes. They'd begun to turn over their engines, and the air filled with heavy rumbling and the fumes of diesel exhaust. George had a sudden, frightening thought and grabbed Kelly's arm just above the elbow. "Don't tell anyone." "I won't." George gripped on Kelly's arm grew uncomfortable. "Not even your dad." "Not even my dad." They ran to their respective buses, the soles of their sneakers slapping on the blacktop, calling 1, 2, 3, and zoot behind them. The school bus left George at the corner and drove off, its engine straining to pick up speed. George walked the half block to her house and turned up the driveway. She fumbled with the house key, balancing her book bag on one knee while she turned the key to the right, but the door was already unlocked and pushed open easily. Mom sat on the couch. "You're home," said George. "What's this about?" asked Mom. Her expression was flat. George's denim bag swung slowly in the air, hanging from one crooked finger. The zipper was open. George's heart pounded, and for a moment she thought she might burst on the spot. She took a deep gulp of air. "I was feeling under the weather today, so I came back home to do some cleaning," said Mom. "Your closet was a mess, and I found these. Did you steal them?" "No!" George's face was hot. I collected them." "Don't lie to me. Where did you get them?" Mom pulled out the copy of 17 from last October, the smiling twins on the cover, unaware of Mom's tight grip. "I found them in different places." Mom eyed George, her eyebrows thick and heavy. She stood with a deep sigh. "George, I don't want to find you wearing my clothes or my shoes. That kind of thing was cute when you were 3. You're not 3 anymore. In fact, I don't want to see you in my room at all." "But I didn't," George began, but Mom ignored her. Mom disappeared to her bedroom with the denim bag in her hand. George remained by the front door, her mouth slightly open. She couldn't believe her friends were gone. And that is the end of chapter 5 and 6. I will be back tomorrow with chapters 7 and 8. I hope you enjoyed today's reading, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.